Okay, there we go. So tonight, I'm really excited to have Shannon Keane join us to talk about Azure VMware Solutions. Sorry, Shannon, I hope I got your surname right.
You did. I think we had talked about
Yeah.
it because it's not like what it looks like at all.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't have pronounced it correctly had we not talked, so that's okay. So Shannon, if you don't know her from Twitter or LinkedIn, is a senior cloud advocate over at Microsoft. And as I say, she's going to be talking to us tonight about Azure VMware Solutions, so I'm looking forward to it. So I'm going to mute my mic and let Shannon take it away. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it. I was just telling, I had to go stop and get my eyebrows waxed. I'll just say that it's fine. And she was like, "Well, why are you so rushed?" And I said, "I have to go do a meetup, and I'm going to be talking to people who are based in Europe." And she was very like, "Wow." I feel like people don't quite understand our role sometimes, especially when they're not used to talking to international people that are in different parts of the world. So, as Carl mentioned, I am Shannon Keane, and I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. The team I work on is enterprise platforms and tools, and the thing we are starting with, or the service that we are trying to go out and get in front of folks who are interested, is Azure VMware Solution. So I'm going to be walking you through today the actual overview of the service so you get an understanding as to how you could potentially position that within your company. Here to answer questions. If you've got a question, feel free to interject. I often encourage folks to connect with me, so I'm very active on Twitter, not as active as some of my other colleagues are, but I'm fairly active on Twitter, and then I'm definitely active on LinkedIn as well. So feel free to connect with me in both places. I will post a lot of good content, and it's not just Azure VMware Solution, it's just Azure all up. I'm a big fan. So let's talk a little bit about the introduction and the background. So if you think about cloud migration considerations, there's a lot of different components, right? It's not just we need to get from one environment to another, right? There, your software might be at end of support. You might need to think about a hardware refresh. It gets expensive, right? We have to all of a sudden replace this aging hardware. Customers get a little weirded out about that. You might need capacity, right? Maybe you're out of capacity on premises. You might need to think about moving everything from on-prem into Azure. And then usually there's a great conversation point around data center contract expiration. Then you have to think about cost and complexity, and that's everything from compliance and standards, all of the security protocols that you need to adhere to. Application refactoring is usually something that happens kind of after you get yourself into Azure. It's not a straightforward process to kind of build out cloud native, but you have to think about when do we do that, and how many resources will it take. Then you have to think through things like business continuity, downtime, HA, and then project resourcing. And then there's always that people and process component, right? So the idea of skilling up your staff, it usually comes with a lot of anxiety, unfortunately. Your engineers have to go and learn something brand new, and you want to make sure that you've got operational consistency. You want to make sure you've got business continuity and disaster recovery factored in, backups, and then you have to figure out at what point do you start building out more and more cloud native, right? Because that becomes an opportunity for you to think about leaning on cloud native technologies. So if we were to really summarize the strategy, you've got rehost, refactor, re-architect, and rebuild. And it's not straightforward to move from left to right. If it was, I wouldn't be in my job. Everybody would already be in the cloud. But prior to, it was just IaaS that you would land on from a rehost perspective. And now you've got Azure VMware Solution, and we actually have an Azure dedicated side of our engineering teams inside of Microsoft as well. So we're starting to really realize we probably should be meeting system administrators and engineers where they are. I was just talking about this before we recorded. I think Microsoft does a great job of meeting developers where they are. We don't always do the same job of meeting system administrators and engineers where they are, but I feel like this is that nice middle ground. Microsoft's reaching the system administrator base where they are without having to have them embrace IaaS out the gate. So some of the challenges with migrations of existing app estates are, you've got that business disruption possibility. You've got mission critical apps that have SLAs that you've been bound to internally. These percentages, 29% of that could be business disruption. Then you've got the cloud skilling gap, 28%. I don't remember where these are being pulled from, but probably a Gartner report. And then you've got refactoring complexity, right? So these are substantial percentages that customers have to think about before they even start realizing the value of cloud and getting their environments out of the on-prem land and more into a cloud-based world. So then that's where we came up with Azure VMware Solution, right? So it's a comprehensive VMware environment as a service. This allows you to run VMs the way that they run on-prem in the hypervisor that most companies still love, right? So it's your VMware environment running inside of Azure. And it's a Microsoft first-party service. So Microsoft will be your first point of contact for any support issues. And it's certified by VMware. So you don't really have to worry about it being outside of support. But I think the big piece here is that third thing here. So it allows you to manage and secure your applications across VMware environments and Microsoft Azure with a consistent operating framework. So you can take the same investments in skills and tools over the years, and you just plug them into Azure. So it's a nice reality, and it usually starts to ease the anxiety conversations that I've had with customers, because now they can take their environment on-prem, move it to Azure, and their engineers don't have to all of a sudden go get certified in the Azure admin cert, right? They can take their time to understand what Azure Active Directory brings to the mix, what Azure Monitor brings to the mix, et cetera, right? So you get the scale and performance and innovation of Azure, but you get to take on Azure at a time that makes the most sense, because what you're leaning on is you've got your environment living in VMware on Azure. So if you think about it, though, Microsoft Azure has infrastructure designed for every workload. So we've got, the Azure native IaaS and PaaS offerings, seamless integration with other Azure services. And this also isn't the first time we've done specific Azure dedicated hardware. We've got Cray, SkyTab, NetApp, Nutanix. These are all purpose-built Azure solutions for platform continuity, so that your customers, or you as a customer, could come in and take your workload on-prem and kind of move it into Azure without really having to do too much outside of some networking magic, right? We'll call it magic. So right now, here is where everything is from a regional perspective. And I think if you followed the timeline, we had Cloud Simple, I want to say it was late 2018, early 19, and that was the first iteration of Azure VMware Solution. We have since moved away from that and realized we needed to have a first-party service. And so this service offering has a number of additional regions that the first iteration of what we did with Azure VMware Solution did not. So, and more regions are coming online too, right? This won't be the end state, but it's pretty vast already if you're looking at it from left to right. There's really no spot outside of Africa, but you could do some nice networking magic to make it work. Or even in the southern part of South America, right? So there's ways you can think about bringing this into the mix here. And I know that there's additional regions coming online. I don't exactly know the right regions, but if you are interested and you are thinking about a global footprint, I always encourage you to reach out to your Microsoft account team. What they can do is they can glue you in to the global black belts, right, or GBBs. And they're the ones that kind of work with you on realizing the value of the technology. And so long as you've got an NDA with Microsoft, you can get all of the nifty roadmap features that are starting to come out that we've at least published and started to kind of march toward. Now, I think we really believe it's the biggest. Well, it's the easiest way to accelerate your journey to cloud, right? You've got the built-in continuity. You can use your existing VMware skills and tools. You can seamlessly modernize your apps over time with Azure, and then you've got the pricing benefits, right? So anybody who has dealing with a lot of Windows workloads, that 2008 R2 from the Windows Server perspective, and then the SQL Server flavors of that same era, you have to pay the extended security updates. If you migrate those VMs from on-prem into Azure because you can't get cycles to move it onto a newer OS, you don't have to pay for those extended security updates. You just get them for free if it's living in Azure VMware Solution. Did somebody have a question? I will assume no. I thought I heard somebody come off mute, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask a question. So if you think about it, the use cases are pretty straightforward: data center expansion, reduction, retirement. You need that speed and simplification of migration pattern, because if you think about it, you're leaning on vMotion. It's HCX guided or assisted vMotion, but it's still vMotion, and you don't have to worry about standing up a configuration server with Azure Migrate. You've just got a seamless way of moving a VM from on-prem into Azure. And then you could think about leaning on Azure VMware Solution for DR as well, right? Along with modernizing your apps inside of Azure once they live in Azure. So you can embrace Azure Active Directory, Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, etc. Once things live so much closer to the ARM APIs, you get a chance to make use of different scenarios or different resources that you would have not necessarily been able to do had your environment lived on-prem. So if you think about it, the planning and deployment becomes a big piece here. So Microsoft's available if you are interested. I know we've got somebody who's already deployed this in their environment, or one person at their company who's deployed it. You could always lean on Microsoft, though. Microsoft has the global black belts. They also have Fast Track. Now, Fast Track kind of help you speed up that process. They'll go through the envisioning stage, get you prepped for what that build out looks like, what the networking topology looks like. But we also have programs and incentives to kind of get you into Azure quickly, as well as we have a number of partners in the partner ecosystem. So, creating the SDDC is pretty straightforward. It takes a handful of hours, unfortunately, but there's automation that's happening behind the scenes. So vCenter is getting installed, NSX-T is getting installed, vSAN is getting installed and provisioned, right? So all of that's happening, and it's unfortunately fairly slow, but once you kick it off in the portal, all the automation happens behind the scenes. You come back after a couple of hours and your whole VMware environment's up and functional. It's very different than what it used to be when it would take months to get something up and kind of working in your environment. Then you'll migrate your VMs, using HCX, that's hybrid cloud extension. And that's essentially what handles your VM migration threads. It works with vSphere, it works with vCenter. It's very integrated with the vSphere ecosystem. And then once you get into the Azure itself, you've got the elasticity and scale, industry certifications, and I think HIPAA just became a thing for Azure VMware Solutions. So healthcare customers are going to be pretty excited. On top of the fact you can think about HADR backup, and then this is leaning on ExpressRoute, so you don't have to worry about a site-to-site VPN, right? ExpressRoute's the preferred way to handle this migration thread, and that helps you from a low latency perspective. But I mean, if you think about it, you still have all the VMware tools too. So you've got, the native vSphere experience, vSAN for storage, NSX-T for networking, that's that software-defined networking layer, and then HCX for migration. And then that really allows you to modernize over time. And there's a number of resources called out here, but we're starting to see customers realize the value of placing some of the services that used to live on, say, a web server inside of a web app, right? Or bringing about application gateway instead of standing up some sort of third-party appliance. They're playing around with tools that were hard to play around with when your environment lived on-prem. So let's talk a little bit about the differentiated features this time around. So it's a first-party Azure service that's cloud certified by VMware, as I talked about. You only have to call Microsoft for support. Microsoft will call VMware on behalf of you. But what Microsoft does is Microsoft will troubleshoot all of the Azure Service Fabric pieces. So if it's something in Azure, Microsoft will troubleshoot. If it's something inside of vSphere or vCenter, Microsoft will engage VMware on behalf of you. You only have to open up one ticket. Microsoft will be that middleman or middlewoman, so to speak. Then you can think about the seamless Azure experience with native integration. So the Cloud Simple version of this, there were two portals. This all now lives in the Azure Resource Manager portal. So you only have to go to one portal, and it's the same spot you would be going for everything, right? So VMs, if you've got them deployed, Azure Active Directory, Azure Monitor, any of the PaaS services, Azure SQL, you go to the same portal that you would for everything else. You can use the Azure Hybrid Use Benefit for Windows and SQL Server. The same rules apply when that VM lives inside of Azure VMware Solution. And you get the free extended security updates for Windows Server 2008, 2008 R2. Single point of support. I should have probably done that a little bit different, but we already talked about that. And then you get the latest VMware technology updates. So engineering will always be N-1 in terms of what's current, because we're testing and validating the most recent version of vSphere, while the one version behind is used by our customers. And so there's a release cadence, there's a patch cadence that Microsoft works towards so that you don't have to be on the hook for upgrades, patching, any sort of hot fixes, or any sort of security updates that are critical. But Microsoft will handle all of that. And oftentimes with our customer base, they're still running something older, right? So vSphere 6, vSphere 5.5, right? Even though these are at end of life, customers, it took them time to try and figure out what came next. And now you could think about a migration path into Azure VMware Solution. HCX, that we talked about, that's the piece that really helps the migration path. What you get deployed today with Azure VMware Solution is HCX Advanced. You've got the capacity to think about enterprise. That's just a straightforward way of adding a different license onto the mix. And it's in public preview right now, so there's no pricing aligned with it. The difference is HCX Advanced only allows for three site pairings between environments, whereas HCX Advanced allows for up to 10. And that's just site pairings between different environments. So if you had an office in Chicago, you had an office in Ireland, an office in, let's say, Singapore, you might want to think about HCX Advanced. But if you had more than that, you want to probably factor in HCX Enterprise. These are high performance dedicated hosts. They're dedicated to you. So when you go and you deploy AVS, you're not on a logically separate environment. Those servers are your servers, which is awesome. And then you've got, unified licensing and consumption. Things are pretty straightforward to figure out what your pricing is going to look like on a monthly basis. You can run Azure Migrate. You can see some of those costs show up in the portal by way of Azure Cost Management. And there's also a simplified NSX interface. So customers didn't move to networking and NSX-T the same way. And NSX-T is how we deliver the networking layer of Azure VMware Solution. So depending upon where your skill sets are, you've got that simplified NSX interface to lean on, which helps. So if you're thinking about the solution, these are the software specifications and hardware specifications. I won't really go into it too much, but it is kind of one version behind what's current right now. So just factor that in. And if you are current, and you want to think about Azure VMware Solution and migrating your VMs over, I'd recommend working with your Microsoft account team, getting a global black belt or somebody from Fast Track involved. They'll be able to work with you and VMware to try and figure out how to get your environment over to Azure VMware Solution, right? But a lot of times our customers aren't on 7.0, so this tends to be an easier conversation. Like I'd mentioned, HCX Enterprise is available. It will be monthly pricing, but there's no pricing right now because it's in public preview. There's only one model, right? So when you build this out, you only have one SKU to choose. I feel like that's going to change. I'll show how you spin it up in the portal. There's a drop down, so that only tells me at some point there will be other SKUs, but there's only one SKU right now. But it's a pretty sizable SKU. You've got a lot of different ways to think about building out your AVS environment with those kind of, I guess, specifications. The math is called at the bottom of the slide here. So there's a minimum of 3 nodes per vSphere cluster. There's a maximum of 16 nodes per vSphere cluster. And now there's also a maximum of 96 nodes to an Azure private cloud instance, which shows you we're ready for the big enterprises. We're ready for you to move your environment from on-prem into Azure VMware Solution. So there's the familiar VMware technologies, the native vSphere support, the fully featured network stack with NSX-T, the vSphere management with vSAN, NSX-T itself, HCX Enterprise you can lean on. You could also leave it at HCX Advanced. Then you've got the integration with Azure. So you can think about Azure Arc enabling your VMs. You can think about Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center. There's extra security you can add into the mix. You can start to baseline your environment to figure out where it stands. There's the low latency connectivity into Azure. The Azure ecosystem is pretty vast. I think if all of you are Azure at the Azure user group, you know that Azure's got a ton of services. So once you get your environment closer to the Azure Resource Manager APIs, there's so much more you can do. Single point of support. You could even think about adding DevOps into the mix, right? DevOps is always that hot term. I kind of hate it, but I kind of love it simultaneously. I feel like people sometimes will say DevOps. They don't quite understand what that means, but it's an opportunity for automation, right? It's less of the manual configuration. So once your environment's closer to the ARM APIs, you can bring about DevOps tooling into your environment and start thinking about automating your builds, automating your configuration management, right? Building out environments pretty quickly without having it go through this rigorous process of approval. Then you've got, the optimized elastic infrastructure, the automated self-service provisioning. You can add new hosts within a matter of 25 minutes. The brand new host will show up. So let's say, you only go with 3 at the start, but you realize over time you need a 4th node. You'll open up a ticket with Microsoft. They'll give you the node, and then adding the node in is 25 minutes, right? I think anybody who's a VMware admin, it's kind of probably blowing your mind a bit. It only takes 25 minutes before it's back up and it's active. So that's the world we live in now. With cloud infrastructure, things are much faster. And these are dedicated, isolated, bare metal infrastructure that are your servers. There's redundancy and placement control along with security and encryption, right? And that's everything from the Microsoft security side of things, as well as things like customer managed keys. So we've also have the idea of reserved instances. So just like reserved instances for VMs, if you're interested, you can place a reserved instance on your actual AVS environment, which starts to reduce the cost pretty significantly. You can save up to between 30 to 50% on dedicated nodes with reserved instances. Now, it's not going to be per VMs because these are not compute VMs living on the Azure Service Fabric. It is going to be the AVS clusters themselves that sort of are tied into the Azure environment. The Azure Hybrid Use benefit, we've talked about it. You get those, which is great. It starts to add some ease of conversation related to cost. And then the free extended security updates. So let's talk a little bit about the deployment process, because I feel like that's going to get some interesting questions, right? So this is exactly how it looks, just like every other Azure resource. You'll deploy the private cloud in Azure. You'll create a VNET or a virtualized network. I always recommend creating an Azure Bastion and a jump host. Sometimes customers will create a jump host and lock down the public IP with just in time. Doesn't really matter what you wind up doing, but you probably don't want to have a jump host with a public IP that everybody can RDP to, right? It'd be pretty easy to crack that at some point and maybe make it a bit mining Bitcoin mining machine. So then, create a gateway subnet and a VNet gateway. So the service itself, you get your dedicated 3-node cluster. Let's just say it's 3 nodes, right? You'll get an express route circuit as well. Now, it's sort of like the S-series VM. If anybody's familiar with that deployment topology, you get your own dedicated server. You need to connect that server into Azure's network backbone. The way to do that is with an express route circuit. Same with AVS. So you'll connect that express route circuit by way of the VNet gateway. You'll create an auth key in the VNet gateway, and then you'll connect the express route to the VNet gateway. Seems pretty straightforward. There's only a handful of things you can control, and literally you can hit review and create. You don't have to add tags, right? That's kind of crazy. If you think about deployment of vSphere environments of old, a lot of next, a lot of pre-planning, a lot of assessment of what you have. Once you get to that point, though, building it's extraordinarily easy. And then when you connect the VMware environment on premises to AVS, so you'll connect to the jump host behind the Azure Bastion service. You'll connect to the vCenter environment and the NSX-T just to make sure that you're able to do so. The credentials are registered within Azure. You'll enable global reach for on-prem access. So this is one thing I want to bring up. The express route circuit comes with your AVS environment. The recommended pattern is to have your own express route circuit as well for private connectivity. VMware will back your migration pattern into Azure if you have your own dedicated fiber that runs into Azure by way of ExpressRoute. You can think through a site-to-site VPN, but you couldn't have an SLA-backed guarantee on a migration path just because of the fact that in an IPsec VPN tunnel is going out your direct internet. But yeah, global reach is essentially what enables 2 different express route circuits to have east-west traffic be seen. And this enables BGP in your environment as well. And this is where it starts to get a little squirrely and you're starting to realize why I recommend partnering up with Microsoft, at least the global back belts, possibly also fast track, depending upon your engagement with Microsoft. You can get either of them and they can kind of help out. The field is starting to build out more and more of these. So our incubation teams, which are usually the GBBs and fast track, are kind of extending out what the field is able to do. So I feel like this next fiscal year will be pretty interesting. This is going to be a pretty popular service at some point very soon, would be my thinking, given the fact that there's so much interest in terms of customers right now. And then you would join the domain and configure the identity source as well. So you can join this just like you would your vCenter instance on Prem. It does require a ticket to Microsoft support because we don't provide root access to the actual ESXi hosts. As you can imagine, we're trying to alleviate and abstract certain levels of administration. So in order to join the domain, you'd have to open up a ticket and then you get elevated root access to those ESXi hosts. Then it's part of your domain. It's pretty great. So this is the actual architecture I just spoke about, right? So you've got, the initiations happening in the portal. You'll hit the Azure Bastion subnet, the actual resource that gets built here, which is a PaaS resource. Then you'll get into the jump box. And then by way of the express route circuit that's peered into Azure, by way of the virtual network gateway, you're able to access vCenter, your NSX manager. So it's kind of cool if you think about it. But I always feel like when I talk about it, parts of it feel murky, and then I showcase the architecture and it starts to make more sense. So speaking of network architecture, let's talk about that next. So this is basic interconnectivity, right? There's two different types of interconnectivity using ExpressRoute. Basic is just the ExpressRoute circuit being peered into your Azure VNet. Once it's peered into your Azure VNet, then you get access to all of the Azure services. You could, access VMs that are living on the IaaS platform. You could access Azure services like Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, etc. This is great if you're just building out a base case or a use case for bringing this into your environment, right? You don't need hybrid connectivity just yet, or maybe you're waiting for hybrid connectivity. Sometimes it takes ExpressRoute circuits some time to get to an environment on-prem and then connected into Azure. So this would be basic connectivity. Then we've got full interconnectivity. This is where it gets a little interesting. This is where you're introducing BGP to the environment. This is where you are taking that ExpressRoute circuit, you're peering it to the Azure VNet, so you've got access to all your Azure services. But then you're also making use of an on-prem ExpressRoute circuit that you own, and you are handling the traffic routing by way of global reach. So this is essentially the recommended pattern if you're going to migrate a hefty amount of VMs from on-premises into Azure, just because of the fact that you want a VMware-backed SLA, you want to play within their rules, so to speak, but you could also stand up a site-to-site VPN. Now, in this environment, just know it's for pre-ExpressRoute testing, or if you just need hybrid connectivity into Azure VMware Solution, you could think about spinning up a site-to-site VPN. It's something that shouldn't be long-term for migration, so that's just the big thing to really hit home here. But you can think about dealing with an IPsec VPN tunnel into a vWAN hub and a VPN site, and then you've got full-blown connectivity because that ExpressRoute circuit will be also peered into the same vWAN hub. So it's interesting if you think about it. A lot of the areas our customers get tripped up on surrounds networking, but those are the two different types of connectivity. And then you could also think about site-to-site VPN if you are waiting for your ExpressRoute circuit, or you don't necessarily need an ExpressRoute circuit for migration. Which brings us into migration or migrating. So these are sort of the pre-migration steps in the process, right? So you want to assess your environment. That's always true of if you're going to IaaS, you still want to assess what you have. A lot of times customers don't know what they have. They have a sprawling environment. They've let their middleware admins build and build and build, and nobody really knows what's living on some of these servers because that's just the nature of how things have been, I guess, accomplished up until now. So then you want to identify the workloads to migrate. You'll define the migration approach using HCX. So if you're familiar with migration, you could think about a live migration, which is usually what a lot of customers pick, especially if it's a production workload that really can't have downtime. You could also think about a bulk migration. Let's say you have 30 servers that you've got approval to move over a weekend. Do it with bulk migration. That'll be parallel migration threads. Those servers will be over in a matter of, I'm not exactly sure on the amount of time, fairly quickly. We'll just say fairly quickly because each environment's a little bit different too. Or you can think about cold vMotioning, right? So you define the migration approach dependent upon the appetite for downtime. Then that sort of helps you identify steps for full production. This is then where you kind of move to that POC realm. This is where you're sitting with the global black belts or you're sitting with the fast track folks trying to build out that proof of concept, maybe even an MVP. The way in which they build things now, they're trying to build it like it will be in your environment full time for the long haul. Then you'll create the private cloud. You'll move a few VMs, with that preferred migration type. That'll start to build out what it looks like. And really, either you'll have the GBBs work shoulder to shoulder or fast track working shoulder to shoulder, or you could also just lean on them to do it as well. It really just depends upon what you're looking for. But then you're able to transition to production, right? So you get that at scale migration and adoption. You can use Microsoft Fast Track, like I had mentioned, in the sense that they can come and they can just help you do that full-blown migration. Then there's support from certified partners. So our partner ecosystem is pretty vast right now, and it continues to grow. I just had a partner in the Chicago area reach out to me recently indicating their want to be part of the partner list, so to speak. So we're working on trying to get them listed and certified. There's a certification path that they have to go through or some attestation. I'm not sure the right terminology, but there's some work that the partner has to do, and those partners can be brought in to help you out as well. So I think the big piece here is Azure Migrate is the tool to use for your actual assessment of your environment. And this reached GA in, let's see, it would have been March. I don't know if you feel like me, but each day kind of blends into one another now that we're living in this global pandemic. So at Ignite in March, the Azure Migrate components went from public preview to full-blown GA. And this will help you right-size your environment. This will help you figure out, what do I need to run? How many nodes? What's the cost going to look like? And if you're not familiar with Azure Migrate, know that it's kind of like the centralized hub for all things migration related to Azure. You can run an Azure Migrate assessment on a bunch of VMs and figure out the cost if they were to go onto IaaS. There is a web app functionality, a database migration path scenario, as well as VDI. So this Azure VMware Solution add-on only makes sense because you're still thinking about migration and you probably want to understand the cost. Azure Migrate does a really good job of helping you out on that front. Now, there are other tools. There's like RV tools. There's a couple of other tools you could potentially run, but Azure Migrate really is finely tuned for Azure VMware Solution. So HCX is the hybrid cloud extension. That's how you migrate from on-prem into Azure. This is where you can save a ridiculous amount of time, right? You're vMotioning a server. I think anybody who's a VMware admin has vMotioned a server, right? It's amazing technology. So you can vMotion your server from on-prem into Azure. My mind blew up a bunch thinking about that reality and how much easier that would make the conversation with customers that were reluctant to move to cloud. So you can use the live migration components without the cost, complexity, or risk of refactoring. Sometimes when you're using other tooling to migrate a server from on-prem to Azure, you're cutting it over. There's a period of wait time. Is it going to come back up? Is it going to boot up correctly? Will it know where it is, right? There are times that you just would flip something over and it would be stuck. You didn't know, right? So there's a lot of pieces that this helps with if you're migrating a VM from on-prem into AVS. Minimal downtime. You can extend to use the same tools, skills, and policies. So you're not really reinventing the wheel. You're using the same tooling that you had prior to. And that really helps with the cost of reskilling. It's not an easy proposition to take your engineers and send them off to training for a week or give them time to learn about Azure. They can take the same skills that they have in the VMware realm and bring them to Azure. So this is where you can think about the large-scale bulk migration using HCX. Like if you had 50 servers, 100 servers over the weekend, you could migrate all of them. There's replicated assisted vMotion. There's also any vSphere to vSphere migration. So it's very much so the quote-unquote Swiss Army knife of VMware's environment. And it's essentially a secure proxy for vMotion and replication traffic. You'll set up a site pairing between whatever environment you're trying to migrate VMs off of, and then it'll talk to Azure VMware Solution, and that'll transition over an express route circuit. There's parallel VM migration threads. There's also the opportunity to have no change in IP, so you can extend layer 2 into Azure. And if you've got a hard-coded app, a hard-coded IP'd app, you could think about not having to change that. I always feel like that sort of helps bad patterns or bad practices, but sometimes there's environments where the developer is no longer with the company, the developer left ages ago, and the app works. They just patch it and make sure it reboots, right? So it's
I know a few network admins that would panic at extending layer 2 into panic/have heart failure at extending layer 2 into Azure. Sorry to interrupt there.
No worries.
We have a couple of questions. I think Peter there had a question, and then we have a couple in the chat.
Let me take a look at the chat here. So my apologies.
Peter, do you want to jump on the mic and ask your question?
Yeah, Shannon, you were possibly getting on the answer there anyway. But so when we do migrations to Azure using Azure Migrate, certainly anything of any kind of scale, then typically we're changing the addresses as part of it because there's we can't have the same address space at both ends of the express route or VPN circuit. But usually when you're doing a vMotion, it tends to be across a stretched subnet in a localized data center or something like that on premise.
Correct.
So the question then I was going to have was around if we're doing like a live vMotion from on-premise VMware into AVS, then what are the implications for networking? Because like you say, Carl, stretching layer 2 into Azure like that often isn't either advisable or wanted by kind of network and security teams.
Sure.
So can the IP addresses be changed as part of that vMotion operation in the same way that it can be with Migrate?
Yeah, they definitely can be. It's a matter of setting up the switching prior to. So, and then AVS is interesting, right? Like, so you give it a /22 network when you're building it out. That's at the minimum. It can be bigger if you want it to be bigger. And then that's an IP address scheme that only AVS sees. So that's another extra weird layer that you have to factor in. But if you're thinking about all the weird sort of nuances of the different IP ranges, and then HCX allows you to stretch that network, it's just a matter of kind of pre-planning prior to that vMotion exercise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just as a kind of follow-up to that, if it's all right. So if you're going to try and stretch your layer 2 between on-premise and Azure, I'm guessing a lot of that kind of work is being done by NSX. So do you have to be doing full cloud foundation on-premise? Like,
No.
Yeah.
No.
So
yeah. So
does HCX do it without, in the absence of NSX?
Correct. HCX is the one that actually does the layer 2 extension.
Okay.
NSX-T does not, because of the fact that you're right. Not every single customer had NSX-T or VMware Cloud Foundation on Prem, right? But HCX is pretty straightforward to stand up and set up the appliance and establish the site pairing. Once that site pairing is established, there's a couple of extra configuration pieces that you would need to make within HCX Manager on Prem and then HCX in the cloud. And then you're able to extend that layer 2 network by way of the vMotion activity or exercise.
Excellent. Thank you.
So let's see. Can we use Azure Backup for backups and Azure Site Recovery rather than VMware SRM? You can. So I will talk a little bit about the integration story here, but you can use Azure Backup. You can use Azure Site Recovery. With Azure Backup, though, remember it's going to be Microsoft Azure Backup Server. It won't be Azure Backup, so you have to stand up a MABS server at some point inside of Azure to be able to handle that. But you can very well and easily do that. I'll talk a little bit about the third-party, I guess, backup vendors that are also certifiable at this mode. Not certifiable in terms of crazy. They've gone through the certification realm of being able to back up AVS workloads. And then SRM, so at some point, this will be a part of your environment. So you could think about bringing an SRM license key, but it's not available yet. So I think it's in private preview. If you're interested in experimentation, I'd suggest talking with your Microsoft account reps, because I do believe they'll be able to get you glued into the right folks. And again, it's a private preview, so you're going to be on the hook for providing feedback, which is always, sometimes customers love it, sometimes customers hate it. So just be aware that if you decide to go down the realm of a private preview, you're going to be asked by engineering to provide feedback throughout the process. vRealize, so there was an announcement that happened, I want to say a week or two ago. It's another BYOL license key. So if you are a heavy vRealize shop, you can think about extending that into Azure VMware Solution, and then bring your own license key. That's where you'd be working with VMware and then Microsoft on the pricing. I'm not exactly sure how all that stuff works out, but your VMware folks would be pretty eager to talk to you about it, because it's a newer relationship or a newer reality to start to see these two environments work better together. So there's more automation capacity and capability. Let's see. So good question. So Microsoft will always support the environment, whether you've got VPN or ExpressRoute. The big piece to hit home here on is you lose VMware's SLA-backed guarantee if you're migrating a VM on-prem into Azure VMware Solution over a site-to-site VPN. Hopefully that makes sense. Oh, I just answered the question. Goodness gracious. All right, cool. Let's see. What process does Microsoft follow when applying updates? Okay, yes, they do. They inform organizations before they apply the updates. They add an extra host into the mix. So let's say you've got 4 hosts. They'll add a 5th host in. They'll do that actual vMotion. They'll relinquish all of the VMs off of the active host that they're patching, and then they will put that host, the host that's actually belonging to you, they'll put it in maintenance mode. They will patch it. Critical patches get applied fairly quickly. So when those critical updates come through, you'll get a notification fairly quickly on when they're patching it. And remember, they also have to test it. So it's one of those things where it may not be like within the hour, but it'd be very shortly thereafterward. And you can always, open up a support ticket with Microsoft if you're curious as to how some of that works out. And then we think about taking version upgrades, right? So going from 6.7 to 7. I know it's on the roadmap. I don't know the exact timetable, but if you were going through an upgrade, same sort of thing, you're going to get a notification from Microsoft as to the upgrade and when they're going to handle it, and then when they're going to patch certain things as well. So there's also, regular like monthly patching, just like with Windows servers and Linux servers, same sort of capacity. You're going to be notified. You have a specific window that you have to apply the patches by, because remember, Microsoft's handling the bulk of the burden of responsibility. So let's do this. I'm going to start kind of moving in more to here because I just look at the time. All of a sudden I blew through and it's like 2:47 my time. So I think a lot of us have seen this. Instead of Azure in the middle, you can think about Azure VMware Solution living there. You get the same capacity to think about governing, configuring, monitoring, protecting, and securing. Notice how MABS is talked up here, and so is Azure Site Recovery. So it's a familiar and consistent VMware tools and technology, so you can access everything like you normally would. This looks just like vCenter on-prem. And then you've got the idea of being able to just continue your day-to-day. So credentials are registered in Azure to connect to the private hosts. I'll show you how to do that, or where that shows up in the portal. And then you've got seamless management for Azure infrastructure resources. So, in this picture right here, you could just edit the number of hosts and add hosts inside the portal, right? That seems pretty straightforward. Much easier than procuring the equipment, racking and stacking, making sure everything's plugged into the right network, et cetera, right? So it becomes an easier reality when all of this is more automated, living behind the Azure Resource Manager portal. And then I've talked about this, but it's a minimum of 3 nodes per cluster, 16 nodes in a vSphere cluster, and then 96 nodes to an Azure Private Cloud instance. This is the shared responsibility matrix. I'll leave it here for just a second or two, but just realize Microsoft's dealing with the bulk of the responsibility. So patching, the ESXi host, any power supply failures, that's Microsoft's problem, not your problem. Hardware failures, Microsoft's problem, not your problem. The portal, physical security, physical infrastructure, dealing with lifecycle management, configuration, right? You get to focus on the things that probably make more sense to your company. Lifecycle managing your VMs, dealing with applications, dealing with the virtual machines, right? That's your responsibility. So this is one way to kind of showcase the architecture. Again, everything sits behind the Azure portal. Your private cloud's here. It's connected into the Azure VNET, as well as the edge routers that then talk to your on-prem environment by way of the express route. Management is pretty straightforward. I'll showcase this. You manage everything in a couple of different sections within the portal. And then if you can see here, you get the credentials are abstracted to you. All you can do is copy it. Right? Prior to, you had to supply the password, and then you had to open up a ticket with Microsoft and rotate that every 90 days. And that did not work out so well. So now it's a little bit more automated behind the scenes. And then you access it by way of PowerShell, the AZCLI, and the jump host, right? So the jump host is all your VMware-based stuff. And then the AZCLI or PowerShell, that's if you to do some sort of automated thing with the cluster itself. But it literally looks just like vSphere, right? Looks like vSphere on Prem. However, you're not going to see the westus.avs.azure.com. And then the hybrid lift and shift. So you're doing all the site pairing, the interconnect, the network extension, that's the layer 2 extension, and the migration patterns are just show up in there. I'll hit on the integrations pretty quickly as well, so we can hopefully get to the demo in time. Make sure, how am I doing on? Okay, so we're still good on the questions. So these are what we have right now. So Azure NetApp file, or these are, I should say, these are common. There's more you can do, but we're seeing customers adopt the NetApp files for file shares, leaning on Azure Blob Storage for your content library, thinking about bringing on Azure Traffic Manager, Application Gateway, their support for hub and spoke topology, Azure Backup Server, Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, and Azure Sentinel. This is a pretty straightforward way of thinking about the architecture, right? You can lean on Azure Automation. You don't have to bring SCCM or add an SCCM endpoint in the cloud. You could lean on Azure Update Management to patch your VMs. That will work. Then you've got the ability to have everything report into a log analytics workspace. You have the ability to onboard Azure Security Center, which then could feed into Azure Sentinel, because remember, they're all sort of tied to that log analytics workspace, as is Azure Monitor. So this is Azure Backup. So this is the quick architecture on the right. Everything's coming into here, but the actual MABS server needs to live in the Azure VNet. You just register everything on the vCenter side with the MABS server, and then it's able to read the objects, it's able to back up the VMs, and then you can have that live in a recovery services vault, which starts to alleviate some of your backup costs. This is probably a little easier to read architecture. And then these are the vendors that are available today. So if you're a Commvault user, you're a Veritas, your Veeam user, that's supported and available today, which is awesome. So you don't have to worry about, I guess, needing to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. If you didn't want to go about and deploy Azure Backup, you could lean on these vendors. More are being certified. The support, I won't spend too much time on this, but this hits home again. It's Microsoft as your sole point of support. And then these are cool. So we've got hands-on labs, and I will provide this as part of my presentation today. These are these are not Microsoft. These are VMware hands-on labs. So if you're familiar with VMware's offerings, you're able to do click-through guided demos, and you've got the private cloud deployment and connectivity as well as the migration. So it's kind of a cool reality. And then we're building out Learn modules. So this is the first Learn module that's out there. We probably need a better vanity name at some point, but we needed something quick. And the migration Learn module was being worked on, as well as the intro. And then these are great resources. So the overview, documentation, there's Azure VMware Solution videos. They're a little older. They deal more with Cloud Simple. However, the technology isn't completely different. The VMware ports and protocols, the HCX documentation, the release notes for HCX, because that does tend to change over time. And then Azure Migrate, which brings me to the demo. So let's do this. I can probably, there we go. I sped through all that. So let me check. Yay, Veeam. I think everybody, I run the community edition at home. I tried to play around more with Azure Backup, and I can always set it up, but over time, it loves to give me weird errors and fail. So the community edition for Veeam, I'm a big fan of.
Yeah, Veeam's an awesome product.
Yeah.
From an IT ops background, before I get into Azure, it was Veeam. I've used my current employer uses a lot of Commvault, but yeah, I used all three of the ones on the slide there. But Veeam's the one that's rescued my saved my neck on a number of occasions.
Yeah. Well, and I love the granularity too, because I had a tape drive fail, and then I was like, God, and that's how I got started with Veeam. I'm like, God, did Veeam actually back it up correctly? So I was noodling around in there, and it did, and I was like, thank goodness. So then I became more of a Veeam believer. Not that I always had such minimal hopes with backups, because they oftentimes didn't work, and it was oftentimes you inherited a poorly configured backup solution. That was largely a lot of it. So I came into an environment that had Veeam, and that's when I became a big fan of it.
Yeah, it's a great product.
So let me just show you how easy it is to create an Azure VMware Solution environment. I won't be able to create it because remember, it does take 2.5 to 3 hours to provision. Looking for it, right? Here it is. And then you create it. You tie it to the right subscription. This is not even the right subscription for me. You place it in a resource group, and we'll just put it here. I won't actually build it, but you're providing a name. So let's just say, and there's a SKU. This won't actually work because I have it deployed in one of my subscriptions. And so you have to register the resource provider. You have to get your subscription whitelisted. Even though it's GA, there's capacity management that has to happen. But what would show up here is AB36. You can allocate the right level of hosts. Remember, you can go up to 16 on a single cluster. This is where you type in the address block for AVS. That's the IP address range that will only be used by AVS, won't be used by any other components of Azure unless you do the stretched layer 2. And then you can tie it to a virtual network. Now, customers will do this, customers won't do this. If you are a brand new customer to Azure, this is an easy thing to do. Just create a VNet that's got a gateway subnet, and then Microsoft will do all of the express route peering for you. If you have an express route circuit, leave this blank. You'll still be able, because you see it's not a required field, you'll still be able to build the environment. And literally it's as simple as hitting review and create. And then 3-ish hours later, you have a fully configured environment, which is much different than VMware builds of old. So this is the environment that we have in our world inside advocacy. So let me make sure of something. I'm surprised it shut up. All right, so let me do this. Make sure that Azure Mask is working. There it is. Gives you a nice readout of what's been deployed, right? It's in North Central. This is your primary peering subnet. This would be if you were doing the peering to Azure by way of the express route circuit. Secondary peering subnet, private cloud management, everything will live there, as well as the vMotion network will live there. I won't spend any time on these. It's the same things you should be fairly familiar with if you've been building things in Azure. This is where you get to the management components. So this will spit out, it's got to establish a connection. So this is the vMotion network. Let me turn off Azure Mask for a second. You see it's the 10.5.1 network and the private cloud management shows up there. Toggle it back on. Here's the express route ID, the private peering ID, and then this is the ER, the express route auth key. You can request an auth key for global reach. If you chose not to let Microsoft handle it automatically, this is where you would request the authorization key if you were trying to peer your express route into Azure from a newly freshly built AVS environment. This is HCX. This is where you'd get all your info on how to get into that environment to start migrating VMs. So this is the activation key that I'm using right now for the on-prem world, and we've been creating documentation for the Learn modules. You could public IP enable it. You could connect it to Azure Virtual WAN. There's all kinds of interesting stuff you could do. And this is Express Route Global Reach. This is where you add your Express Route circuit, and I don't have one, but this is where you'd add your peered in Express Route circuit from on-prem. Like that slide showed, this is everything for how you access the environment. So the web client shows up there. You log in with this account. The password is behind there, certificate thumbprint, right? So that's kind of cool. Microsoft will handle that for you. And this is like what that screenshot showed. I can edit this and change my cluster node count from 3 to 4. And then you just hit save or 10 or whatever you needed, right? This is where we get down to the simplified NSX interface. So this is the uplink, the HCX uplink. You can add new segments in here. Like I had mentioned earlier, we're in the process of building out some Learn modules. So this is a freshly built environment. So there's not going to be a ton of stuff in here just yet. This is where you can set up your DHCP server. So if you needed a DHCP server to hand IP information over to a VM as it's being built in the environment or migrating over, you could build your DHCP server here or register it here, as well as your DHCP relay. You could think about port mirroring. You could do some troubleshooting. And then you could also build out a DNS zone or a DNS service in here. So that's pretty much everything you'd be able to touch inside the portal. There's a handful of PowerShell commands, handful of AZCLI commands you could use as well. But I think the big piece here is let's go into the jump host. So I've got a Bastion. Look for my password. For some reason, I should be able to remember it by now. It's not like it's the first time I logged into the environment. Okay, actually, let's do this. I was moving around earlier today. So let's open up a brand new browser window, and then let's go back into the SDDC. Now, SDDC stands for Software Defined Data Center. I think a lot of VMware admins would probably know what SDDC stands for, but in the event you're not familiar with what that is, that's what it stands for. So let's copy the password. Oh, wait, sorry. So it looks just like vSphere on-prem or vCenter on-prem. Go there. Let's go back. Let's copy the password. And it is just like vCenter on-prem, except that you see northcentral.avs.azure.com, and you see that plugins were deployed earlier today. But the same sort of concept. You can go into your hosts and clusters, your VMs and templates. This is where you could have a content library live on Azure Blob Storage. You could even go into HCX from here, right? Got to update this. That's where you set up your site pairing. This is your network extension, right? So there's all kinds of stuff you can do in terms of setup. I don't know why it's taken so long. In theory, usually this does work. And then vReal as ops, right? So you can go into there and you can start extending what you're doing, so long as you've got the right license key to think about kind of automation on that front. She definitely would, and she's seen this. So I think I gave her a shout out when I showed this to her. But really, this shouldn't matter, right? Microsoft at some point could pick a different vendor down the road. So right now it's Dell EMC. It could be a different server vendor at some point down the road. You really shouldn't have to worry about that. Microsoft will worry about that for you. But yeah, you're able to still see it just like you would if you deployed it on-prem. So that kind of takes us to the end, and it's a little over. So I did kind of speed up the end of that because I was talking pretty heavy on the beginning parts of it. But I've been adding new slides, and you can tell I haven't gone through this as best as I possibly could. I'm just getting off vacation, so my apologies.
It's all good. It's really interesting to see. Thank you very much. Has anybody got want to jump on the camera or the mic or in the chat and ask any questions of Shannon?
So what's the initial cost of setting this up? So you get the first 30 days for free. And then the 3-node cluster, the pay-as-you-go, it looks pretty expensive. I think it's about 20 grand a month. And before you freak out, remember the reserved instances start to bring down that cost. And once you deploy this, you can deploy whatever you need to deploy on those. You're not being charged for the VMs on an individual basis once they're in that environment, right? And so the interesting secret is sometimes, depending upon your IaaS landscape or what it would look like to have everything land on IaaS, AVS can be cheaper when you apply those reserved instance discounts. So if you're running 150, 200 servers, it could be more inexpensive to run it on AVS than running it on IaaS outright. The monthly cost. Oh, so it's about 20 grand. Let me see if I can pull up. It shows up in the Azure pricing calculator. Let me share my screen again here. So you can tell we're looking for large enterprises.
Yeah, I mean, once you start to scale what you have on premise, I mean, 20 grand might seem a lot to small, medium businesses, but once you're getting the enterprise scale stuff, then it maybe not seem like so much, you know?
Yeah, so I wanted to showcase this. So it's still showing Cloud Simple. So anything with CS, that's Cloud Simple. AV is the version you want to go with. We still are supporting Cloud Simple, but just be aware that the brand new SKUs will always be AV. That's the SKU you want to go with. And these are bigger hosts. They are, they're about the same price point. Actually, no, the same exact price point as the 36 cores, 512 gigs of RAM. So, but yeah, so this is what the pay-as-you-go price would be. And then you could always add in, let's see, here's the 1 year. All right, look at that. That went down 7 grand a month, and that went down over 10 grand a month. So that's where our customers are realizing the value of reserved instances. Is if it's going to take you some time to unravel what you're doing and to skill up your staff, that 3-year reserved instance is very much so worth it, because you can have a number of VMs living on those nodes, and it might ultimately be cheaper than running them all on different IaaS VMs inside of Azure.
Okay, there was a question about Cloud Simple there,
Yeah,
but Peter answered it. So.
Yep, thanks, Peter. I appreciate it. So yeah, so it gets confusing. I've heard customers call it version 1.0. Now we're on version 2.0. It's just Azure VMware Solution by Cloud Simple, and now Azure VMware Solution as a first-party Azure native type service.
Excellent. It'll be interesting to hear from some people that are actually using this stuff in the field. Peter, is version 1 using this anywhere or thinking about using it anywhere?
So we're not at the minute. It's something that is of particular interest to me because I've got a load of VMware experience and customers in my background. So I'm definitely interested in it. But as things stand right now, we're not doing it because we tend to try to transform when we get to the cloud rather than just lifting and shifting where possible. So the even with reservations or whatever, the 10 or 15 grand a month is a harder sell whenever it's a short-term migration when you're actually on the road to transformation or refactoring anyway.
Yeah, it's not the right solution for everything. I think that's something to factor in.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so Shannon, if you were a company now and you were looking to go into the cloud, what would be the benefits of using this over just using like the vanilla Azure?
So I think it's the idea of upskilling. So I used to work with customers prior to this role, and I always had the customers where the anxiety had gone through the roof. You showed up to the room, you were telling them they had to move their servers from on-prem into Azure. You had to stage an Azure Site Recovery server. This is prior to Azure Migrate even, right? And you were running a lot of different assessments, and you were trying to figure out what's like for like look like, how much latency could you handle. There's a lot of stuff that tends to get, I guess, brought to light when you're thinking about a migration path. And what this would have done for a number of customers that were enterprise scale, this would have alleviated the conversation of them freaking out about what does cloud look like. I mean, because as we all know, an IaaS VM is not terribly dissimilar to a VMware VM, right? It's still a VM. It's still living on a hypervisor. Yeah, it's Hyper-V. It's a flavor of Hyper-V, but I mean, a VM's a VM's a VM. And so I think when I talk with customers quite a bit, you'll start to realize there are engineers that have just not thought about cloud. They have been hanging out in the world of VMware for so long. And to take them and kind of realize that they've got to pull their mindset out and kind of look towards cloud first, this might be a good stopgap solution or a solution for them. Because I mean, Microsoft will support this, until we have no reason to support it, right? So, and that tells me, given the fact there's a lot of technical debt out there, although my boss has told me I need to be nicer because he's like, a lot of companies don't even know that they have technical debt. They think it's technical excellence because they don't know it's bad for them, right? But I mean, if anybody's been a consultant, you've probably worked with customers that are just mounds and mounds and mounds of technical debt. And to try and decouple all of that and make sense of it and make sure it's on the right solution inside of Azure, whether it be IaaS or PaaS or a variation of a stitched together solution, this might be a nice stopgap for them while they start to figure it out. So it really kind of lends itself well to those customers that don't have a lot of time to upskill. Maybe they're out of contract expiration for their colo or for wherever they're hosting their production gear, and maybe their production gear is up for refresh. That's an expensive proposition. Maybe this makes sense, right?
Yeah. So it's more for existing companies rather than. So I set my own business up tomorrow, and I'm wanting to make, set the infrastructure up. Is the benefits of going to VMware in Azure in the cloud than just using VMs in Azure? If that makes sense.
Yeah, so I would think that this is very much so existing customers of VMware. That's the major target point. If you're starting out with a brand new company, you have the luxury of not having the mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds of technical debt. Plus, you don't have 10 to 15 years of people being skilled up on maybe even 20. Let's be honest, it's getting close. 20 years of VMware experience. You could go cloud native. You could run your environment on a web app with like a database backend. Could be a number of different database offerings, right? There's a different way of thinking about this if you're more of a startup, and I think that's why a lot of startups have gravitated towards more cloud native, Kubernetes, app service, et cetera, versus something like Azure VMware Solution. So let's see, any limitations when signing up for the 30-day trial? You do have to whitelist it. You have to work with Microsoft support to whitelist the subscription. That's because they're also managing capacity in each one of the regions. And so they need to know what subscriptions have 3 nodes, what subscriptions don't have anything allocated. And so you have to open up a ticket. Your subscription gets whitelisted. It's the weirdest general availability I've ever seen in my life. But once it's tied to your environment, you'll be in once you register the resource provider. So you've got to first, open up a support ticket, get that whitelisted for your subscription. Once all that's done, you register the resource provider, and then boom, you can just go set up the AVS environment pretty simply. Yeah. And it's weird because I've talked to people who have worked with other services, and they're like, I've never heard of this sort of whitelisted subscription. And I'm like, yeah, but we're dealing with like actual hardware. So, that's 3 pizza boxes that are accounted to one customer. And they're bigger hyper-converged nodes, so they have to make sure they have enough capacity in their regions. And so that's just why they want to be in control of it, so that they don't get in a situation where they can't allow somebody to go spin it up.
Okay, excellent. That's really interesting. None of the customers we're dealing with are probably big enough at Action Point to be looking at this. 30 or 40 VMs potentially for some of the big ones,
Much
but
smaller.
big enterprises. As you say before, they would consider refreshing hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars worth of hardware and data center fees and that. It's a viable option, I think. So.
Yeah.
Excellent. Shannon, if there's no more questions, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate you taking time out of your workday to join us.
Sure. I always love it. It's good to talk to people who are ending their day. So hopefully my day ends as nicely as yours.
Thanks a lot. So if nobody's any other questions, thank you all for joining us at another LDNA. If anybody wants to speak at the July session, the slot is still open, so give me a shout or submit on Sessionize. Drop me a message on Twitter or LinkedIn, or just text me if you've got my number. Anything Azure, I'd take a bit of .NET if I had to, but anything Azure's where I sit. But no, seriously, if anybody wants to speak at July or August, sure, give us a shout. Everybody have a good evening and a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Shannon.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.